My fiancé is perfect except for this scar on his shoulder he refuses to talk about. While doing laundry, I found a hospital bill from 5 years ago for a surgery he never mentioned. He didn't have an accident. He donated a kidney to a woman who is now my new boss, and she calls him every night at midnight. I stood in the laundry room, the scent of lavender detergent suddenly turning sour in my throat as I held the proof of a life-altering lie. My fiancé, the man I thought was my soulmate, had a secret carved into his skin that he never intended for me to see. The crumpled hospital bill in my hand didn't speak of a biking accident. It spoke of a surgical extraction that linked him to my boss. Every midnight, while I lay inches away from him, he was tethered to another woman by a debt of blood and bone. Our perfect engagement was nothing more than a carefully constructed facade built over a hollow space where his kidney, and his honesty, used to be. The hum of the washing machine usually sounds like peace to me. It's the sound of a home well tended, of a life that finally stopped being a series of emergencies. But that Tuesday the rhythm broke. A metallic clink 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 echoed against the drum, the sound of something left in a pocket that shouldn't be there. I stopped the cycle, reached into the wet, heavy fabric of Mark's old canvas hiking jacket, and pulled out a small waterproof pouch he must have forgotten. Inside wasn't a set of keys or a handful of loose change. It was a folded, yellowing piece of thermal paper, the kind they hand you at a hospital discharge desk. My hands were still damp as I smoothed it out on the granite countertop. The words didn't make sense at first. Nephrectomy post-op care was printed at the top, followed by a billing code for organ procurement services. The date was exactly 5 years ago. I looked at the paper, then at the hallway leading to our bedroom, where my fiancé's favorite sweater lay draped over a chair. My Mark, the man who gets lightheaded when I stub my toe, had undergone a major surgical procedure to remove a kidney, and I was reading about it for the first time on a laundry day. We had been together for 3 years, and in that time I thought I knew every inch of him. He is the kind of man who remembers which tea I like when I'm stressed. Earl Grey with a splash of honey, never milk. He spends his Saturday mornings in our small backyard, painstakingly weeding the marigolds and humming tunes I don't recognize. My fiancé is perfect, save for one physical flaw. A jagged 4-inch scar that sits like a pale lightning bolt on his left shoulder. Whenever my hand strayed toward it during a quiet moment, he would gently catch my wrist, kiss my palm, and tell the same tired story about a mountain biking accident in his early 20s. He'd laugh it off, saying he was young and reckless, and then he'd deftly change the subject to what we should have for dinner. I believed him because I wanted to. You don't question the man who builds you a life out of kindness. But as I stared at that hospital bill, the biking accident story dissolved. A nephrectomy isn't a biking injury. It's a deliberate, calculated sacrifice. The bill wasn't even addressed to his old apartment. It was sent to a private billing office I didn't recognize. Why hide a gift like that? Why carry a scar of heroism as if it were a mark of shame? I realized my fiancé wasn't just modest. He was hiding a connection to a past life that apparently didn't include me. The unease didn't stop at the laundry room. It followed me to work. 2 weeks ago, I started a high-level administrative role at Vance Logistics, reporting directly to the CEO, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor is a woman who commands a room by simply breathing in it. She's elegant, sharp, and carries herself with the poise of someone who has cheated death. From my very first interview, she treated me with an odd, shimmering intensity. She didn't just ask about my spreadsheets. She asked about my home life, my fiancé, and how we spent our evenings. I thought it was just her way of being a people person, but there was a hunger in her gaze that made my skin crawl. On Wednesday, she invited me to a working lunch in her glass-walled office. She looked tired that day, her skin a bit sallow beneath her expensive foundation. She pushed her salad away and sighed, leaning back in her leather chair. "You know, Sarah," she said, her eyes fixing on mine with a strange, watery gratitude, "I wasn't supposed to be here to see this company grow. 5 years ago I was fading away. A miracle happened, a lease on life that most people can't even dream of." The date hit me like a physical weight. 5 years ago. A donor. I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A guardian angel," she corrected, her hand instinctively drifting to her side. "Someone who gave me a part of themselves so I could keep building my empire. I owe that person everything. Every breath I take is a debt." I couldn't eat. I kept seeing Mark's scar in my mind, then Eleanor's hand on her side, then the hospital bill on my counter. The math was simple but the logic was terrifying. My fiancé hadn't just had an accident. He had saved the life of the woman who now paid my salary. And he had never said a word to me about it. Why was my boss speaking about my husband-to-be with such a proprietary air? That night, the silence in our house felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Mark was his usual self, attentive, warm, asking me how my day with Eleanor went. I watched him move, noticing for the first time how he favored his right side when he lifted the heavy cast-iron skillet. I wanted to scream, to throw the bill on the table and demand the truth, but something stopped me. I needed to see how deep this went before I alerted him that I knew his secret. I went to bed early, pretending to be exhausted, but I stayed wide awake, my ears ringing with the sound of my own heartbeat. At exactly 11:58 p.m. I felt the bed shift. My fiancé moved with the practiced stealth of a ghost. He crept out of the room, his footsteps silent on the carpet. A moment later, from the hallway, I heard the dull, rhythmic vibration of a phone. I slid out of bed and pressed my ear to the door. "I know," I heard him whisper. His voice was different, lower, filled with a raw, aching intimacy I thought was reserved only for me. "I'm here. How are you feeling tonight? Did the medicine help?" There was a long pause as he listened to the voice on the other end. "You don't have to thank me every night, Eleanor," Mark said, and my heart turned to lead. "I made a choice. I'm tied to you now. I'll always be here when the clock strikes 12. Just breathe. I'm right here." I stood in the darkness, trembling. My boss was calling my fiancé at midnight, and he was comforting her like a lover, or perhaps something more intense. A biological twin bound by blood and a stolen organ. This wasn't just a secret, it was a ritual. He wasn't just my partner, he was her life support. The next morning, the sun crawled through the kitchen window, mocking me with its brightness. My fiancé was at the stove, flipping blueberry pancakes as if he hadn't spent the middle of the night whispering sweet orisons to another woman. He looked so wholesome in his flannel shirt, the steam from the griddle rising around him. "Sleep well, honey?" he asked, smiling as he set a plate in front of me. I watched his hands. They were steady, but as he reached for his phone on the counter, I saw a minute tremor in his thumb. He checked a notification, his face softening for a split second before he masked it. It was a message from her, I just knew it. "Mark," I said, my voice sounding strange and hollow in my own ears. "I've been thinking about your health. You've been looking a bit tired lately. Maybe you should go for a full checkup? Especially with that old biking injury, you wouldn't want it to cause internal issues." He froze. It was only for a heartbeat, but the mask slipped. He laughed, a short, nervous sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm fine, Sarah. Really. Just some long hours in the garden. That scar is just a memory of being a dumb kid, nothing more." He went back to the pancakes, spinning a fresh layer of lies about a trail in the Pacific Northwest and a fall that never happened. I looked at the blueberries on my plate and felt a wave of nausea. I wasn't sitting across from my husband-to-be. I was sitting across from a stranger who had sold a piece of himself to the woman I worked for, and in doing so he had sold our future to her too. I took a bite of the pancake and smiled back. I would play the long game. I would find out exactly what Eleanor Vance thought she owned, and I would find out why my fiancé thought he had to hide his heart, and his kidney, from the woman he claimed to love. The engagement wasn't a promise anymore. It was a debt collection, and I was going to make sure everyone involved finally paid what they owed. The air in our home changed after that breakfast. It became thin and cold, like the atmosphere at a high altitude where every breath feels like a struggle. I spent the next few days watching my fiancé move through our shared spaces as if he were a guest in his own life. Mark was physically there, sitting on the sofa or pruning the hydrangeas, but his spirit seemed to be vibrating on a different frequency, tuned into a signal only he and Eleanor could hear. He began carrying his phone everywhere. Into the shower, to the mailbox, even keeping it face down on the nightstand like a loaded weapon. The first real crack in our foundation happened on our 3-year anniversary. I had spent weeks planning a quiet dinner at the bistro where we first met. I wore the silk dress he loved and waited for him to come home. When the front door finally clicked open, he didn't have flowers. He didn't even have his shoes on. He looked frantic, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the hallway. Before I could say a word, his phone buzzed. He didn't just check it, he practically lunged for it. "I can't go, Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Eleanor." She had a scare. A sudden spike in her levels. She's alone and terrified. I have to go to the clinic. The clinic? I asked, my voice steady despite the roar in my ears. Mark, she has a staff of nurses and assistants. Why does she need you? He couldn't look me in the eye. He just grabbed his keys, his hand trembling. She doesn't have anyone who understands, Sarah. Not like I do. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. As the door slammed shut, I realized that my fiancé wasn't just a donor. He was a tethered soul. Her health had become an invisible leash, and every time she felt a phantom pain, she whistled and he ran. I sat at our beautifully set table eating cold appetizers alone, realizing that in this relationship, there were 3 of us, and I was the only one who didn't know the rules of the game. The following Monday at the office, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. I found myself hyper-aware of Eleanor's presence. I watched her through the glass partitions of her executive suite. She sat behind that mahogany desk, the queen of her empire, but her eyes were constantly drifting to a small silver-framed photograph tucked behind her computer monitor. One afternoon, while she was in a board meeting, I slipped into her office under the guise of filing quarterly reports. I leaned over the desk to see the photo. It was a picture of Eleanor in a hospital gown, looking frail but radiant, standing in a sunlit garden. Beside her was a man, but the photo had been meticulously cropped. Only a shoulder and a hand were visible. A hand with a very familiar, slightly crooked index finger. My fiancé's hand. She was keeping a shrine to her savior right under my nose. Later that day, Eleanor called me in. She didn't want to talk about logistics. She leaned back, her sharp eyes scanning my face with a terrifyingly intimate curiosity. "Tell me, Sarah," she began, her voice smooth as cream. "Does Mark still have that habit of humming when he's focused? And does he still prefer his tea with honey instead of sugar?" The room felt like it was spinning. "How do you know how he takes his tea, Eleanor?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. She smiled, a slow, predatory expression. "Oh, you learn a lot about a person when you share a life-changing event. He's a special man. Very sacrificial. You're lucky to have him, though I sometimes wonder if you truly appreciate the depth of his character." She wasn't asking me, she was telling me. She was studying me, comparing my knowledge of him to hers, as if she were the rightful owner of his history. My suspicion turned into a desperate need for visual proof. A few days later, Mark told me he was running errands at the hardware store. I waited 5 minutes, then followed him. He didn't go to the hardware store. He drove to a secluded park on the edge of town, a place we used to go for picnics when we first started dating. I parked a block away and watched through the trees. He was sitting on a bench, his head bowed. A moment later, a sleek black car pulled up and Eleanor stepped out. She didn't look like a CEO, she looked like a woman seeking shelter. She sat next to him and they spoke in low, hushed tones for a long time. They looked like a grieving couple, 2 people bonded by a tragedy the rest of the world couldn't understand. Then the sight that broke me. Eleanor reached out and placed her hand on his left shoulder. She traced the line of his scar through his thin shirt, her eyes closed, her forehead resting against his arm. It wasn't a romantic touch, it was a gesture of absolute ownership. She was touching her property, and he was letting her, his eyes filled with a weary, heavy devotion. I went home in a daze, my mind a storm of resentment. I knew I had to go deeper. Mark had a small locked drawer in his desk that he claimed held old tax documents. I'd always respected his privacy, but that respect was a casualty of his lies. I found the spare key hidden inside an old hollowed-out book. When the drawer slid open, I didn't find tax papers. I found a thick stack of letters, tied with a simple blue ribbon. As I read them, the true scale of the betrayal came into focus. These weren't just thank you notes. They were a chronicle of a transaction that went far beyond an organ. 5 years ago, Mark's family had disowned him for reasons he'd never explained to me. He was broke, alone, and facing a medical crisis of his own. Eleanor had stepped in. She didn't just pay for the surgery. She paid for his recovery, his first apartment, and his education. She had funded the very version of the man I fell in love with. One letter, written in Mark's handwriting just weeks after the transplant, chilled me to the bone. "You gave me a reason to live when my own blood turned their backs on me. I am your guardian now, Eleanor. As long as this kidney beats inside you, my life belongs to yours." Our entire romance, the dates, the engagement, the house, it was all built on the financial and emotional foundation provided by my boss. I wasn't just his fiancé. I was the person he was using to try and feel normal, while he remained a permanent satellite to Eleanor's son. The final straw came at the annual company gala. The ballroom was draped in gold and white, filled with the city's elite. Mark was by my side, looking dashing in his tuxedo, but he was stiff, his eyes constantly tracking Eleanor as she moved through the crowd. When it was time for the keynote speech, Eleanor took the stage. She looked magnificent, draped in emerald silk. She raised her glass, the diamonds on her fingers catching the light. "To the silent partners," she said, her voice echoing through the silent hall. "To the selfless heroes who give us the strength to continue when we are at our weakest." She turned her head and looked directly at me. No, she looked through me at Mark. Her hand moved to her side, resting firmly over the place where his kidney now lived. In that moment I saw the truth in her eyes. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a twisted, mutual obsession. They were locked in a dance that I was never invited to join. Mark wasn't looking at me, he was looking at her with a terrifying intensity, a silent confirmation of their pact. A cold, hard fire of resentment ignited in my chest. I realized then that they had turned me into a ghost in my own life. They thought their secret was a bond that couldn't be broken, but they had forgotten one thing. A woman who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. I took a slow sip of my champagne, the bubbles biting at my tongue, and began to map out exactly how I was going to dismantle their beautiful secret world. The champagne bubbles felt like tiny needles against my tongue as I watched them from across the gala floor. The fire of resentment didn't make me scream. It made me cold, calculating, and incredibly efficient. If Eleanor Vance thought she had purchased a life, she was about to learn that some debts are paid in reputation rather than blood. I didn't quit my job the next morning. Instead, I arrived early, my smile brighter and my coffee stronger. I became the perfect employee, the one Eleanor trusted with her private files and digital logs, all while I quietly archived the evidence of her using company funds to keep Mark's life afloat under the guise of consulting fees. I spent my lunch breaks tracing the money. It wasn't just a kidney, it was a monthly retainer for his silence and his soul. To the world she was a philanthropist. To me she was a ghost owner of my fiancé. I decided it was time to bring the two worlds into a head-on collision. On a rainy Thursday I called Mark and told him I'd forgotten my laptop and needed him to drop it off at the office. I timed it perfectly, knowing Eleanor would be walking through the lobby for her afternoon press briefing. When Mark arrived he looked uncomfortable, his shoulders hunched as he tried to blend into the glass and steel of the Vance Logistics lobby. Eleanor emerged from the elevator, her face a mask of corporate perfection until she saw him. The air seemed to vanish from the room. I stepped between them, playing the doting fiancé, adjusting Mark's collar right over his scar. "Mark, honey, you remember my boss, Eleanor?" I chirped, watching the blood drain from his face. Eleanor's poise shattered. Her hand flew to her side, a reflexive twitch of the organ that bound them. They stood there, two statues of guilt, unable to speak a single word of greeting while the interns bustled around us. I watched the sweat bead on Mark's forehead and felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The secret was becoming too heavy for them to carry in the light of day. That night the tension reached a boiling point. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. At 12 a.m. sharp, the phone on the nightstand vibrated like a rattlesnake. Mark's hand crept out from under the covers, but I was faster. I lunged across him, snatching the device before his fingers could graze the screen. He sat up, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen. "Sarah, give it back," he whispered, his voice trembling. It's just work." I ignored him and swiped the green icon. "Hello, Eleanor," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. The silence on the other end was deafening. I thought I'd save Mark the trouble of waking up tonight. He's had such a long day of lying, he really needs his rest. But since I have you, I wanted to tell you that I've seen the bill. I've seen the letters. I know exactly what's sitting under your ribs, and I'm done sharing my husband with a woman who thinks she bought him in a hospital wing. Sarah, you don't understand the bond. Eleanor's voice finally broke through, sounding frail and desperate. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I countered. "You don't want a donor. You want a monument to your survival. But the monument is moving out. Don't call this house again." I hung up and threw the phone onto the carpet. Mark looked at me as if I were a stranger, but for the first time in years I felt like myself. The climax came 3 days later at an intimate dinner party Eleanor hosted for her top investors. I had insisted we go, and Mark, terrified of what I might do, followed like a beaten dog. The room was filled with the scent of expensive lilies and the clink of silver. As the main course was served, I stood up, tapping my wine glass. The room fell silent. "I'd like to make a toast," I began, looking at the prestigious guests. "To Eleanor Vance, a woman who truly knows the value of an investment. Most people buy stocks. Eleanor buys people. She has a very special miracle story, one involving a kidney and a young man she's kept on a leash for 5 years." I pulled the yellowed hospital bill and a copy of one of the letters from my clutch, laying them on the white tablecloth for the person next to me to see. The gossip spread like a wildfire around the table. Eleanor's face went from pale to a sickly gray. Her saintly reputation as a self-made survivor was being rewritten in real time as a story of a woman who manipulated a vulnerable man into a lifetime of emotional servitude. "It was a gift," she hissed, but the investors were already leaning away, the scandal of a bought donor and secret midnight calls staining her professional polish beyond repair. I turned to Mark, who was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. "It's time to choose, Mark. Right here in front of your owner. You walk out that door with me, you confess everything to the authorities about the financial arrangements, and we start over with nothing but the truth. Or you stay here and wait for her next midnight call in a house built on lies. What's it going to be?" The silence stretched for a minute. Mark looked at Eleanor, then at me. I saw the hesitation, the deep, ingrained fear of losing the security she provided. He didn't stand up immediately. He didn't grab my hand. He looked at the table, his silence speaking louder than any apology ever could. He was too far gone. The debt had hollowed him out until there was nothing left for me to love. I didn't cry. I felt a strange, cold lightness wash over me. I reached down, twisted the diamond engagement ring off my finger, and placed it firmly in the center of his dessert plate. "I'd rather be alone than be the third wheel in a medical tragedy," I said quietly. I walked out of the dining room, the sound of my heels on the marble floor the only noise in the stunned house. The next morning I was gone before the sun hit the driveway. I didn't take much, just my clothes and the sense of self I'd almost lost. I drove to the coast and parked the car, watching the sun begin to bleed over the horizon. For the first time in 3 years my chest didn't feel tight. I wasn't waiting for a vibration on a nightstand. I wasn't wondering why a scar looked the way it did. I realized then that Mark and Eleanor deserved each other. They were locked in a cycle of needing and owning that had no room for real love. As the light grew brighter, I took a deep breath of the salt air. I had lost a fiancé and a career in 72 hours, but as I watched the waves, I knew I had gained something much more valuable. I was no longer a guest in a life built by someone else. I was the architect of my own. I turned the key in the ignition, put the car in gear, and drove away from the shadows, heading toward a horizon that finally belonged entirely to me.